Hello everyone, my name's Laura-Beth Cowley and I made this short film Boris Norris. I'm here today to answer any questions you might have about my film and sort of show you some of the processes that I went through to make the film. This is Boris from Boris Norris, and the general film is kind of a 2D take on like the kind of old 1920 style animation that you might have seen in stuff like Steamboat Willie with Mickey Mouse, and you might know of now with the Cuphead game that's going around at the moment, and that kind of style of hosepipe animation. And so it was interesting for me to look at the idea of replicating that in stop motion, which is not new. Like there's lots of people that have done it in the past and were major influences on the film. Films like companies like Screen Novelties and early Will Vinton kind of styled animation. So this is Boris, and he's made from a whole mix of different processes and materials, and his arms and legs and majority of his body are made out of alley wire and silicone casting, and then his head was 3D printed. He's got a hard solid core foam made out of like the solid black foam called plastizote, and his eyes are made out of milliput, and his mouths were created using Fimo, which is the kind of hard baking clay. And then we had lots of different, I can't really show you this, lots of different iterations of the mouth, and they were all hand carved. So basically the idea was that for his head and his facial animation, everything was replaceable and done in plates so that we could take it away. So if anyone's seen the trailer for the film, you can see that there's this this really nice slide motion, which is very reminiscent of 2D animation. It's called a smear, and that's how we created that. And you can see here are some of the replacements for the smear test here, which were also made out of Fimo. If you go to my blog at borisnorrisfilm.weebly.com, you can see some more of the making of process. But so these would be the heads would be taken apart, and you'd pop the eyes off. It's a bit gory, and replace them with sliding eyes of different iterations, and you only need them for like a single frame, and it creates that kind of smear effect. Okay, so the first question I've been asked was, was this your first experience of making puppets? And no, this was my MA film. Oh, and also just to answer this other question that's come in, no, they're not done with magnets. They were done with white tack and this really dense wax, just to keep them in place. But for the eyes, mostly white tack, because I didn't want... Magnets are tricky, and then you have issues with lining things up, and really strong magnets can then drag things off faces, and it's a difficult balance that I just didn't feel really prepared to sort of take on. And to be honest, a lot of the time tacky wax or white tack will do when you're doing something quite independent and low budget, I guess. But to go back to the first making experience, no. So Boris Norris was my MA film. So that's a master's degree over here. But I did an undergrad film. Well, I did several undergrad films. The way my undergrad was structured, we had to do a film we had to do 4 films on our second year, and then we did one large one on our third, or 2 semi, like a middle one and then a big one. They were very short fire, like quick fire, kind of make an idea, come up with how you're going to do it, make it, film it, and then finish. So the first puppet I made out of wire, and it doesn't exist anymore because it was very low tech and crumbly. And he was meant to be like Lionel the Lion Face Boy, who was a performer in the 1920s who had this condition that caused massive hair growth. So that was the first stop motion film I ever made, and that was made in my student halls on the kitchen table. And then I made, what did I make after that? Then I made a group project with another 2 girls from my course, and we made a woman who was meant to be like a clockwork doll inside of a grandfather clock, and that was a hybrid film of a 2D animator and designer made all the materials and all the skinning and the design for the character, and then we had a CG girl that did the interior of the clock and the set essentially, and then I made the puppet and then animated the puppet, and then we green screened that into a CG environment with a certain level of success, but it was an alright film, kind of. And then the next film I made, I actually have the puppet. I made a mime, which is a very classic trope for stop motion. I don't know why, we tend to like mimes. I think it's that idea of performance. But yes, so this is Pierre, very original name. And he is a ball and socket armature that's then covered in hollow foam, and then just has material clothes that were stitched over the top, and a solid head, which isn't detachable, and he had little bead eyes similar to that of like James and the Giant Peach, and then he also had very similar mouth plates to Boris Norris, which were then just replaceable and take-offable, and that was my first short film with no real brief. It was, the only brief was that it had to be submitted into festivals, so I made this in mind for super short festivals where it's like a minute long, and it went around a little bit but not very much, so yeah. And then in my third year I made and then in my third year I made a film called Difficulty, which was about my experiences with dyslexia, and I think that puppet is elsewhere at the moment, but he essentially was a puppet that interacted with words and sort of visualized my issues with words and dyslexia and that kind of thing. So yeah, long and short of it, no, this wasn't my first puppet, but it was my first attempt at silicone casting and that kind of thing. I can actually show you some of the moulds. So here is a silver alloy aluminium resin mould, and this was for the hands. We had a lot of issues with silicone, which was mostly down to the fact that we weren't massively experienced, and we were also using a type of silicone that is traditionally more used for moulds, so it was very dense. It was also, we were using a lot of different things from people that, because we were very fortunate to be donated quite a lot of materials, so we were kind of working with whatever we had around. And we went through a lot of different processes. We tried inject moulding. That's why you can see like little bits of white, which we then ended up filling up with milliput, because we tried injecting moulding for about 2 months and it just never worked. We tried degassing the silicone, we tried degassing the moulds once the silicone was in, and it just wouldn't work. And in the end we went for the very low-tech approach of just painting in the silicone in the different areas we needed. So because the arm and the hand are all one just mould, so we'd paint in the flesh layer and then this t-shirt layer, and then we would half fill on both sides of the mould for the hand and the arm, and then we'd put in a thin layer of both and sandwich it together and pray that it would fuse, and that's how we ended up making all of our arms and legs. And because we need legs quite often, mostly because the wire at the points of the legs. So this is Norris, the other puppet, which I've sort of taken apart just to show you things. So there would be a thick piece of alley wire, because we were using twisted, but then it just kept breaking, and it also wouldn't hold up the weight of the boots or anything else of the puppet, so we ended up using the thickest gauge of alley wire you can get, and then casting the silicone round, and then so that's why this was a difficult puppet to make, and also he's quite, like, I don't know, this seems like he's not too big, but that's quite big. Like, that's the size, that's more than my forearm, and you can see that his legs are bent, so fully extended he's about half a metre tall, which is very big for a stop motion puppet. So I wouldn't suggest doing that. But it was more because we realised during production that we weren't going to have enough time to do both big and small scale, so we went for this kind of medium scale that meant that we could have close-ups like this and this in the film, and we wouldn't need to build a much bigger puppet. But for the general sequences where they're like running, that was not fun to animate, because they're not structurally very sound. So there's some other characters in the film. There's a seagull, and he's incredibly low tech. He's his plastic body, and then he's covered in what is like this very thin foam that was dipped in latex, and then that covers him to create the shape, and you can sort of snip foam him away. The same with his legs. He's got wire in there so that it's like adjustable, and polymorph around the lower and upper leg to give it some more structure. And his beak is milliput, and then we spray gunned the colour onto them, and we actually just dipped the legs into latex because it's a nice fused legs, and the legs are painted with latex and ink, and the body is just acrylic paint and latex. The crab also, this is one of the crabs, but I don't think he ever got actually used in the film. He was one of the first puppets I made, but it was more just sort of proof of concept and just to sort of understand the shape and the design in 3 dimensions. But he, once again, hard plastizote core, and then the wire I put in for the legs and the pincers and the eyes through the core, and then I milliputted over the body to keep it nice and solid, so it's pretty solid. And then I built up the arms and the legs and the claws out of layers of latex dipped sponge, and oh yes, I do know Max Winston. He was a massive influence, especially as Mr. Woodman's I basically used his film as proof of concept to sort of say, look what you can do with stop motion if you sort of go about it in this way. So yeah, big fan of Max Winston. So yeah, and then I just tipped the ends of the feet because I liked the kind of scuttly nature of the crab in milliput as well, and the eyes are milliput, and then they just have a just a simple model maker's glaze on the top to keep them like shiny and able to keep the sticker on. The eyes, the pupils of the eyes, which are this kind of pill shape, was a great find by my model maker Sasha Lawrence, which was it's just a stamp. I think it's for card making, but it makes these 2 little lines, So it saved us having to like hand cut lines and lines of plastic. And this is just vinyl sticker plastic in black, and then you just put this in, and then it makes pupils come out. So we went through thousands and thousands of those because they just fall off, and so the floor was just littered in them. No, not all the puppets are covered in latex. Just the crab and the seagull, and there was a miniature crab, but I'm not sure where he is at the moment. He was sort of falling apart. But the crab that they actually interact with, which is about this big in comparison to this crab, and it was just because it was cheap, and it's an easy way of making this kind of rubber hosey plastic Max Winston style of puppet. I wanted that kind of almost sticky, visceral feel to the puppets. I'll show you another mould, because this was a mould we were quite proud of, which was for the Wellies, because we knew, I'm not sure why we felt we needed to have an indentation, but we just thought it would be nice. So these Wellies are actually quite structurally a welly, like they have an indentation inside, and then there's K&S inside that plugs it into the legs. There's also a foot plate in there, so it holds its shape slightly. So when you're doing like a really extended long pose for like a stretch. And that involved needing a 3-part mould. So we have the mould, we have the shape of the welly, and then this plugged into the top. So what we would do with that is similar, paint it, put in the plug, fill this side, and just sandwich them together very quickly. And normally the silicone's tackiness would stop the plug from falling out, and then just clamp it and wait for it to go off. We used an insane amount of catalyst to make it go off very, very quickly. So the story is based around 2 twins from my hometown who used to collect driftwood, and their entire house was full of driftwood, and I always found them interesting characters. I come from an island off the coast of England, and so I always found them fascinating as growing up, and I always thought they'd be good story fodder. And this was originally going to be a much quicker, shorter turnaround of a film, and it was going to be 2D because of the hose pipiness. But when I got to the MA, I sort of presented it as one of my ideas for a film, and my tutor sort of was like, well, if you want to be a stop motion animator, you should probably make it stop motion. And I was like, oh yes, that probably makes sense. So I did, and it was the best decision I probably made on the MA. It was a really fun project. It was nice to make a stop motion where I wasn't worried too much about everything being perfect, or even structurally that sound, as long as it looked good under camera. That was the main goal. So that's where they come from, and originally it was going to be a lot more subtle, and it was more about like them as brothers and their relationship, and then I decided it was getting a bit too serious and I wanted to be more fun and upbeat, so I made it about them being unwilling or unable to share, and over something that you wouldn't necessarily want anyway, so a bomb. So yeah, it's quite fun. And so how many people worked with you in the pre-production? In the pre-production, quite a lot, because the way that we sort of structured is we'd have, there was about 12 of us on the MA, so we'd have group crits. We'd also meet up and have our own private crits with one another and discuss our films and our ideas. We'd have group crits with our tutors who would then run through it. So I had 2 main tutors that critted my film and helped me work on the story, who were Chris Webster and Lewis Cook. Lewis Cook is an Aardman animator Aardman director who is now a senior lecturer at UWE, but was the director of the Pierre sisters. So he was very, very good at sort of breaking down my film and asking all all the hard questions as to whether it would structurally make sound, make sense to people, and sort of basically made it a much stronger film. But yeah, so in pre-production there was that, and then I had Sasha Lawrence, who was my model maker, and so we worked together to make all the moulds, and she helped she sanded all of the heads down for the 3D for the replacement heads. So these are all the replacement heads for the puppets. So they started off life like this, but rougher, because this is one that Sasha did start to move, and they had a hole 3D printed in them prior ready for the nose, and then she would, so that's a bit rougher, I don't know if you can see that, yeah, so that's a bit rougher, but then she would fill in any holes or things left that were left and weren't meant to be there with Milliput, and then she'd sand them, and she sanded them for ages, and then she'd take them through and paint them using a spray pen. Pretty sure that's the wrong word, but and then that would get to that stage, and then, like I said previously, all the bits and bobs for the head are they're detachable. So we have mouth plates, we take those off. We have eye plates, we can take those off. We have a nose. This one's glued in now because it's this is really for display purposes, but we'd have a nose which would come off as well if need be. It was mostly for that one scene with the swipe